Decimate is a powerful modifier used to reduce vertex count and create unique patterns. Today we'll learn all the settings you need to have full mastery over this modifier. To start off, I'm going to add an object to actually decimate in the first place. So I'll press Shift A to open my add menu, and then under mesh I'm going to choose torus. Then if I come down to this blue spanner here, I can add a modifier, and I can just press this add modifier button, and then in the search bar I can just search for decimate. Now we're ready to go over some of the settings. To start off, we're going to go over the most intuitive one, which is Un-subdivide. If you're familiar with the subdivision surface modifier, it essentially creates new geometry. The Un-subdivide option on the decimate modifier will do the opposite. So for example, if I set this number to 2, it will halve all of these faces, giving us a simpler form of the geometry. You'll notice though, if I turn the iterations back to 1, we get this cool diamond pattern. So there's also some great, more creative options that you can use this modifier for as well. We actually added this to a torus in my latest free course called Rendering and Animation for Beginners, and we used a torus with this pattern and combined it with a curved component to create this interesting swirl shape. In summary, I would think of the Un-subdivide option as the inverse of the subdivision surface modifier. The first option though here is called collapse. Rather than increments, collapse will remove vertices using a ratio. For example, 0.5 will halve the face count. So I'll left click the ratio here and type in 0.5, and you can see it started taking away some of the vertices, but you can notice this does it in a much more randomized manner compared to the Un-subdivide. The purposes of this would probably be a lot more artistic for this example. And you can see as I turn this ratio down, we will get less and less faces until we get something very simplified like this. Something you'll notice as well is that it creates a lot of triangular faces, and that is something to keep in mind when using the collapse method. I'm going to turn this up to 0.5 just now. I'm also going to add a second object. I'm going to press Shift A, and then under mesh I'm going to choose cube. I'll press G and Y to pull it out, and if I press tab to go into edit mode, we don't really have much faces actually decimate. So I'm just going to press A to select all, then right click and choose subdivide, and I'm just going to turn this number up in this menu here in order to add some more faces. Maybe something like 10 will do for now. Then I'm going to add the decimate modifier by coming to this blue spanner, pressing add modifier and searching for decimate. I'll come back to collapse and I'm going to give this a value of 0.5. Since this object has a flat surface, we can't actually see the decimation. To fix that, we can come up to this overlay button here, and I can turn on this wireframe option. Now we can see pretty much what the collapse modifier is doing. I'll maybe give it to a lower value like this. And next up, I'm going to cover this symmetry option. If I enable this, you'll notice how things have now been mirrored across the x-axis, which is this red line. You can also see this in the center here. Notice how if I turn this back off again, the symmetry disappears. You can of course do this for other axes as well. For example, I could change this to the y-axis, and now it will be mirrored across this green line, or the z-axis if I wanted it to be mirrored up and down. I'll turn that off for now, and next we'll go on to triangulate, which will essentially just make all the square faces, which are known as quads, which is essentially just a face with 4 vertices or 4 edges, and it will turn them into 2 tris instead, whereas tris will just be left alone as they are. Tris is pretty much just a triangle shaped face, a face with 3 edges or 3 vertices. If I zoom in here and turn this off again, you can notice the difference. Vertex group will allow us to limit our decimation to a certain area. I'm going to come back to my torus for this, and I'm first going to press tab to go into edit mode. Since we haven't applied this modifier, we'll still have our original faces available here. I'm just going to left click and box select all of these. If you can't box select, it's probably because you don't have this selected. Notice how if I come up to the top left hand corner, I can left click and hold on this, and I can choose an option here. You can just choose select box. Then I'm going to come down to this green triangle here called Object Data Properties, and here we can create something called a vertex group. This is pretty much a way to just select a certain part of our object, and we want to be able to select these faces we have selected here for this example. So I'll press plus, and then I'm just going to press assign, and that's going to take all of these selected vertices and add it to this vertex group. You can also remove selected faces from a vertex group as well, but since vertex groups aren't the focus of this tutorial, that's all I'm going to cover. I'll then come back to this blue spanner, and if I was to choose this vertex group here and then come back into object mode, you'll notice how the decimation is only happening in that vertex group now, and you can see it will happen much faster because obviously there's less faces to deal with. So this can be a cool way to get some localized effects. As for this factor here, this will determine the influence the vertex group has. This will make more sense if I turn this to 0. You can see now it's gone back to now everything being decimated. If I even turn this the tiniest bit up, you can see that vertex group comes in full effect again. But why wouldn't this just be a switch instead of a slider? And that's because vertex groups can actually have a weight. If you've heard of weight painting before, that's essentially creating vertex groups with different weights. When you assign a vertex group like we did, it will automatically set it to 1. Notice if I press tab again to go into edit mode and come to my green triangle again, you can see it has this weight thing here, and since we assigned it with a weight of 1, that means it's always going to be 1. But if we had it something less, then the factor on this slider here would have more of an influence. But if it's set to 1, even just turning it a tiny bit up from 0 will give it its full influence. If that's a little bit too confusing for you to understand, just remember that you can use a vertex group to select a certain area to decimate, and this factor can almost act as like a switch. Next up, we have planar. So if I switch to this here, you can see we have an angle limit, and you can already see that we have a few less faces. So essentially what this angle limit does here is it will determine a certain angle in which to merge faces together. Notice how as I increase this angle here, more faces will get joined together. This is because there's a certain angle between each of these transitioning faces, and as you increase this limit, when it goes over, it will start merging them. The D limit will stop certain faces from being merged in certain areas. Normal will make it the difference between normals facing in opposite directions. If you're not sure what normals are, I have a whole video dedicated on the subject, which you can check out here. For now though, I'm going to show you how you can actually see the normals. So I can left click this overlay button here, and you can either turn on this face orientation, which will make it so normals facing outside will be blue, and normals facing inside will be red, or you can go into edit mode by pressing tab, click this button here, and you can see we can turn on this button here, and that's going to show the direction of the normals. I'm going to turn on this X-ray mode here, and I'm going to go ahead and select all of these faces, and I'll then shift left click and drag and select all of these too. Now I've got half of them selected, I can just press Ctrl Shift N, and that's going to flip the normals. Noticing how the lines are now pointing inward. And also, when I turn off this X-ray, you can see that these faces are now red, indicating that they're facing the other way. Now, as I mentioned, the delimit normal will make it so when the blue normals meet the red normals, there'll be no decimation happening. So you can think of that as the line where these two meet in edit mode, there'll be no decimation. So I want you to have a think about what that might look like. Then we're just going to go ahead and turn on the normal delimit and see if you're correct. If you guessed that it would join right in the middle here, you were correct. Obviously though, delimiting using normals can be a problem because having normals facing the wrong way can look pretty horrible sometimes. But in order to showcase the functionality, I made sure to show you anyway. I'm going to press tab to go back into edit mode, press A, and then I'm going to choose Shift N, and that's going to recalculate the normals so they're all facing outside again. Material will work in a very similar way from the normal option, but this time it'll use two materials to figure out where the non-decimating needs to happen. You might be wondering as well, how do we actually turn off this delimit? And you can just shift left click it in order to turn it off. In order to do this though, we'll need to have two materials, and I'm also going to turn off my normals option just so it's less confusing. So I'll left click this drop down and turn off face orientation. Then I'm going to left click this ball here to go into the material viewport shading. This will allow us to preview our materials. I'll then come to this material option here, press the plus button, and I'm going to press this plus button to add a second material, and then I can add another material by pressing the plus new, and maybe I'll just call it something simple like green and red. But you can call these anything you like. Obviously I'm going to change my base color to something green here for the green, and the red I'll give it a base color of something red. Then I'm going to press tab to go into edit mode. I'm going to press free to go into face light. Then I'll press alt left click and just start shift alt left clicking a bunch of these faces. Maybe this time I'll only do a quarter. And then if you want to add the second material, you can just press assign with this red selected. Now you can see the material I have selected has been assigned to the vertices or faces I have selected. Tab to come back into object mode, and if I want to see this in action, I can just press material, and now you can see where the two materials meet, there won't be any decimation happening. Notice how if I turn this up, you can see no matter what, this isn't changing. And this is the same for the normal delimit as well. I'm then going to press this button here to go back into solid view, and I'll shift left click this material here to turn that off. Next up we have seam. If you've done UV unwrapping before, you'll be familiar with what a seam is, and this will allow us to use seams in order to control the delimit. So I'll press 2 to go into edge select mode, and if I press alt left click, I can now select this entire loop. I can then right click and then choose mark seam. Now I've marked that seam, I want you to think about what will happen when I turn on the delimit here. If you guess right, it will join up here, making sure nothing gets decimated. So pretty much it's preserving this edge that we've selected using the delimit. And again, if I turn this up, you can see no matter what, that's not going to change. I'll shift left click the seam in order to turn that off. We also have this option called sharp, and this works very similar to the seam option. If I press tab again and press 2 to go into edge select mode, this time I'll alt left click this edge here just to give a different example, and that's going to select the entire loop again, and I'll right click, and this time I'm going to choose mark sharp. Now I've marked that, if I turn on the sharp, you can see that it will now stop any decimation from happening at that edge. Noticing if I turn this up, you can see it preserves it. Some of you might be wondering though about what this UV option does. Well, you might be thinking, does it just use the seams? But if you remember, you don't necessarily get a UV unwrap just with seams, although you certainly can. You can also UV unwrap using the Smart UV project. In order to better explain this, I'm going to left click the top left hand corner, noticing how a little cross shape will appear, then left click and drag to pull this out, and I can change this here to the UV editor. Then if I press tab to go into edit mode and A to select everything, at the moment we've just got the default UV for a torus. And that'll probably make it so there's a cut along this torus somewhere, but it's not doing this using a seam. It's actually just a default UV which hasn't been made using a seam. So if I was to turn on this UV delimit just now, you can see that the island boundaries was probably about here for this UV. You can also see this if I press tab and press A to select everything in edit mode, press U and choose Smart UV Project, and maybe I'll give it an island margin of 0.01 and then choose OK. Now we've got a bunch of different islands, and now when I turn this UV on and off, you can see it's preserving edges in certain places where the boundaries of these islands would be. For now I'm going to turn off the UV option by shift left clicking it. This time, in order to show what this all boundaries option does, I'm going to press shift A, and under mesh I'm going to choose UV sphere. Then I'm going to press G and Y to pull this along. Then I'm going to press add modifier, search, and choose for decimate. I'll set it back to planar, and maybe I'll make this a little bit higher. If I set this planar to something really high, you can see we've got a lot of boxes being attached to each other, creating this kind of jigsaw-y effect. If I turn on all boundaries, you can see that those corners here have now been turned into just a single edge. So that's essentially what the all boundaries does. Congratulations, you've now covered all of the main features of the Decimate modifier. Now we're going to go ahead and have a quick quiz to recap what we learned today. Number 1, what option is like the inverse of subdivide? Number 2, what does the delimit on planar do? Number 3, how do we limit our decimation with collapse? Feel free to pause the video and take a minute to answer the questions, and then when you've finished, you can press play and I'll answer the questions. Number 1, what option is like the inverse of subdivide? This would be the Un-subdivide option, and it almost acts like the inverse of the subdivision surface modifier. Keep in mind, this typically works in iterations of 2 in order to get that Un-subdivide effect. Notice how if I set it to an odd number, like 1, it creates an interesting diamond pattern on this torus, which can actually be quite desirable in some situations. But if you want the Un-subdivide effect, make sure to stick to these even numbers. Number 2, what does the delimit on planar do? The delimit will allow us to use a certain feature of our object in order to stop decimation from happening in that location. For example, if I press tab, you can see I've got a seam here, and if I turn on seam, you can see that no decimation is going to happen in that area, no matter how high I turn up the angle limit. You can also use this with other things such as material and a bunch of other options which we covered earlier. Number 3, how do we limit our decimation with collapse? To do this, we use the vertex group. A vertex group is created by coming to this green triangle option, pressing tab, and then just selecting a bunch of vertices, which you can then assign. We already created one, so you can notice if I left click this and press select, this was the vertex group we created. We can then come back to the blue spanner, go back into object mode, and we can then select this vertex group from here, and if we turn down the ratio, you can see the decimation will only happen in that vertex group. The factor can almost act like an on and off switch. If you turn it to 0, it'll just decimate like normal, and if we turn it up, it'll go back to just using the vertex group. Well done on completing today's quiz. If you're not sure if you got any of the questions right, feel free to let me know in the comment section below, and I can answer your questions for you manually. Otherwise, if you have any other questions about today's lesson, feel free to let me know. Also, if you enjoy my teaching style, I also provide one-on-one coaching, completed with personalized lessons and post-lesson quiz questions and support. Link in the description if you're interested. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. You can also support the channel by making a one-time donation through Super, but even just liking, subscribing and sharing if you enjoyed is more than enough to support the channel. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.